In every town, there's someone people trust without question. They bring food to the grieving. They sit by sick beds through the night. They show up over and over when no one else does. Gesche Gottfried was that person in Bremen, a woman of quiet grace and boundless compassion who had lost so many, a husband, parents, even close friends. Some said she had suffered more than anyone else in town. And yet, instead of turning bitter, she turned outward. She gave more, smiled more, helped more. The city called her the Angel of Bremen. To them, she was the very image of goodness, soft-spoken, gentle, and endlessly giving. But behind every act of kindness, something darker was at work. The grief, the mourning, the trail of funerals, none of it was accidental. And the tears she cried weren't just grief. They were part of the illusion. For years, she walked freely among them, praised for her strength and grace, even as those closest to her fell sick in her presence, even as their deaths piled up with eerie consistency. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't about money. This was something colder, more deliberate, the kind of case that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths that live inside the minds we least suspect. What makes a woman do this? What turns nurture into a weapon? This is more than just a case of harm. It's a deeper study in trust and deception. It's a study in control, deception, and the human instinct to believe what we want to see. It's a window into criminal psychology, cloaked in lace and sympathy, and it stands among the most haunting in the world of true crime documentary. This is the case of Gesche Gottfried, and it will stay with you long after the credits roll. At the turn of the 19th century, Bremen was a proud city. Perched on the banks of the Weser River, it was a hub for trade and craftsmanship, a place where cobbled streets echoed with the footsteps of merchants, tailors, and housewives alike. It was a city shaped by tradition, by family name, by the rhythms of church bells and daily labor. And in that world, a woman's role was quiet, domestic, predictable. She married young, bore children, and carried the burdens of her family behind closed doors. A woman who smiled through hardship was praised. A woman who served without complaint was sainted. Gesche Margaret Tim was born into that order in 1785. Her father was a tailor, her mother a seamstress. They didn't have wealth, but they had structure, rules to live by, roles to follow. And for a while, Gesche followed them. She was polite, well-liked, intelligent. People noticed her beauty, yes, but also her calm demeanor. She seemed steady, capable, everything a man might want in a wife, and everything a city expected in a woman. When she married young, no one questioned it. When she bore 3 children, no one blinked. And when her husband died suddenly, people whispered only sympathy. After all, illness was everywhere. Typhoid, cholera, diphtheria. You could go to sleep with a cough and not wake up. No one was shocked when death came, not at first. But what this true crime documentary uncovers, what makes this case so unsettling, is not just what happened around Gesche, but how long it was allowed to unfold without question. It's how long no one noticed. Not because she was invisible, but because she fit so perfectly into the picture of what a good woman looked like. This isn't just a murder story. It's a study in how societal roles can become camouflage, how the expectations we place on women can sometimes become the very thing that hides the danger. And in Gesche's case, it hid a darkness that would take over a decade to name. Or a time, she was just another widow, grieving, struggling, trying to move on. When her husband died in 1813, Gesche mourned like any other woman would. She wore black. She kept her head down. She was left alone to raise 3 children in a world that offered women little protection. In those days, a widow had few choices. There were no social services, no safety nets. You either remarried quickly or you relied on the kindness of your family, if you were lucky enough to still have one. Gesche had pride. She didn't beg, she didn't crumble. She nursed her children, took in sick relatives, kept the household running, even as grief layered itself over her like thick wool. When her mother fell ill the following year, Gesche stayed by her side every night. Neighbors said they heard singing from the window, soft lullabies, half prayers. She cooked, cleaned, prayed. And when her mother died, they said Gesche had the look of someone broken, but dignified. Then came the children. One by one, her daughters grew pale, then weak. Doctors came and went, unable to do much. And when her son, the last of them, cried out in the middle of the night and never woke again, the city grieved with her. No one questioned why she still lit candles in the window. No one asked why she kept baking, kept smiling softly when she walked past. Because in their eyes, Gesche wasn't cursed. She was surviving. To the people of Bremen, she had already suffered more than most could bear. She was the neighbor who never turned away a beggar, the friend who showed up at your doorstep with broth and blankets when your child caught fever. She didn't collapse. She carried everyone. And when she began caring for her aging father, no one blinked. Of course she would. She had already proven her strength. But strength, true strength, is complicated. And in the world of criminal psychology, it often wears disguises. Some people become hard when life breaks them. Some become bitter, cold, violent. But others become something harder to detect. They become pleasers. They wear sorrow like a badge of honor. They give, until giving itself becomes the mask that hides a need for control, until martyrdom becomes a strategy. And Gesche had learned something powerful. People don't fear the woman who cries. They fear the woman who smiles and survives. For years, the people of Bremen had grown accustomed to Gesche's quiet presence, a woman marked by tragedy, moving through grief with the kind of poise that made sorrow look almost graceful. They'd seen her walk behind more than one coffin, head bowed, face composed, as if mourning had become something she knew how to carry. No one questioned it. No one doubted her. That changed when Paul Zimmerman died. He wasn't elderly. He had no chronic illness. He was healthy, respected, well-known in the neighborhood, until the day he collapsed with searing abdominal pain and slipped into a spiral that ended in silence. And through all of it, Gesche was there. She had brought him soup, sat beside his bed, whispered prayers as he faded. His death shook the neighborhood, but this time, the grief felt different. It was tangled with something else. Confusion, unease, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Weeks later, a neighbor who regularly shared meals with Gesche fell ill. Then a close friend she had recently visited. Then an elderly music teacher, known for her sharp mind and solid health, who passed after a long stretch of unexplained stomach pain. The details began to echo each other. Rapid decline, nearly identical symptoms, and in every case, Gesche close at hand, not as a suspect, but as a friend, a caregiver, a woman known for showing up with warm food and a cool cloth pressed to a fevered brow. At first, people told themselves it made sense. Illness was common in a crowded city like Bremen. Food spoiled easily. Sanitation was poor. Outbreaks happened all the time. But as the deaths began to form a pattern, as the faces lost became more familiar, and as Gesche's name seemed to hover quietly around each tragedy, Coincidence no longer felt like a satisfying answer. No one said it aloud, but the silences grew longer. Glances lingered when she entered the room. Hands gripped teacups just a little tighter, and some neighbors began turning away food left kindly at their doorstep. Admiration gave way to caution, not because of hard proof, but because of something quieter: instinct. In most true crime cases, the warning signs are loud: blood on a blade, a missing weapon, a public outburst. But here there was no clear motive, no violence, no shouting, just a trail of quiet deaths, and one woman who stood at the center of it all, still, composed, untouched. And that, more than anything, was what started to frighten them. Johann and Wilhelmina Rumpel didn't know what they were inviting in when they let Gesche into their home. They'd bought her house when she could no longer keep it, and out of kindness, or perhaps admiration, they offered her something few widows received: security. They asked her to stay on as housekeeper, to live with them, to help manage the staff and daily life. To the Rumpels, it felt like hiring a beloved aunt or trusted godmother. But soon after, Wilhelmina became ill. Her decline mirrored so many others: stomach cramps, fatigue, and worsening pain. Again, Gesche was by the bedside. Again, she was praised for her compassion. And again, the patient died. Before she passed, Wilhelmina told her husband she was comforted knowing Gesche would be there to help him through the grief. And so she was. In the months that followed, Gesche took charge of the household. She cooked the meals, oversaw the nurse and the gardener. And when both the maid and the nurse fell sick shortly after, they chalked it up to coincidence. But only at first. The nurse, once recovered, was the first to speak what others hadn't dared to. She told Johann something was wrong. Too many people grew ill around the housekeeper. She said she didn't feel safe, and she refused to stay. At first, Johann dismissed it. He remembered his wife's faith in Gesche. He saw the woman everyone in Bremen still adored. She had nursed his dying wife. She had kept the household running. She had done nothing visibly, tangibly wrong. But doubt is like a splinter. It may be small, but it burrows deep. When Johann himself began to suffer sharp stomach pains not long after, something shifted. This time, he didn't just endure it. He started to watch. He noticed the way Gesche insisted on preparing his meals personally, the way she hovered when he ate, the way she brushed crumbs from the table, carefully, as if hiding something. Then, one evening, he saw something odd: white granules clinging to the edge of his plate. They didn't look like salt or flour, and they hadn't been there before the food was served. Johann scraped a sample and brought it to a chemist named Dr. Loos, one of the few people in Bremen with the tools to test for toxins. Toxicology was still in its infancy, but what the doctor found was unmistakable: arsenic, a white, tasteless powder, commonly used to kill rats, or in some cases, people. With that, the image of the grieving widow shattered. Johann and Dr. Loos reported their findings to the authorities, but by then, Gesche had already fled. Whether she sensed suspicion or simply grew restless, no one knew. She traveled to Hanover, 135 kilometers away, where she took up residence with a friend. But wherever she went, death followed. Her friend, Bet Schmidt, and Bet's young daughter, Elise, fell ill within weeks. Both died soon after, then another acquaintance, then a creditor. Each case eerily familiar, always with Gesche nearby, always with food involved. It wasn't until 1828, on her 43rd birthday, that authorities finally caught up with her. She was arrested and brought back to Bremen, where the city, once so full of sympathy, was forced to confront the woman they had once called a saint. To many, it still didn't feel real. This was a woman who had suffered so visibly, who had helped so many, who had stood beside countless deathbeds with grace. The accusation seemed impossible, but for those who understood the patterns, for the investigators who had begun to treat this as a case of true crime rather than a string of coincidences, there was no longer any doubt. The criminal psychology was becoming clear. She hadn't just killed for gain. She had killed with patience, with planning, with complete control, and perhaps most disturbingly, she had killed with a smile. Gesche's arrest sent a tremor through Bremen, not because people feared her, but because they didn't want to believe it could be her. For years, she had been held up as a symbol of endurance, of quiet strength, of feminine virtue in the face of overwhelming loss. To accept that this same woman, so graceful in grief, so present in the suffering of others, had orchestrated those very deaths, was to question the community's own ability to see truth. And yet, the evidence was building. When news of the charges broke, it wasn't only the grieving families who reacted, it was the entire city. People remembered details that hadn't seemed odd at the time, how illness always seemed to follow her presence, how she often insisted on preparing meals herself, how her companions had a habit of dying just as debts or obligations came due. The case became one of the most talked about stories in Germany, even before it reached trial. It was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national spectacle, the kind that fuels every generation of true crime documentary with disbelief and morbid fascination. Inside the prison walls, Gesche didn't speak much at first. She denied the accusations calmly, as though this were just another hardship she would weather with dignity. But as the months passed and the names piled up, her resistance began to waver. One by one, investigators confronted her with accounts, witnesses, chemical evidence, and slowly she began to confess, not just to one death, but to 15. 15 lives extinguished, husbands, children, parents, friends, not in moments of rage, but through the careful ritual of arsenic-laced food. And those were only the ones she admitted to. Her method was deceptively simple. She mixed a blend of lard and arsenic, poison intended for rats, and spread it on bread and cakes. It was tasteless, undetectable by her victims. And because she administered it slowly, over time, the symptoms mimicked natural illness. To the untrained eye, it looked like disease. To her, it looked like control. The longer she was held, the more she seemed to unravel. Some guards later reported that she spoke to the ghosts of her victims. Others said she would cry, and then, minutes later, return to her calm, elegant self. Whether it was guilt, madness, or simply performance, no one could say for sure. When the trial finally opened 3 years later, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters filled the gallery, onlookers gathered outside. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had deceived an entire city. Her defense attorney argued that she was not of sound mind, that no sane woman could poison those she loved without reason. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They described a woman who thrived on being needed, who created illness in others so she could play the role of caregiver. They spoke not of greed, but of a deeper hunger, one that psychologists today might label as a form of narcissistic manipulation or factitious disorder. It was a textbook case of what we now recognize in criminal psychology as a compulsion to control through care, weaponized nurturing. She didn't kill to eliminate, she killed to be essential. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom was silent. There was no celebration, no cheers, only a cold understanding that something deeply unnatural had unfolded in their midst for years, hidden behind the ordinary. Gesche was sentenced to death, Her execution was scheduled to take place in Bremen's Cathedral Square, a public event, as was customary at the time. She was told she would be allowed one final glass of wine, and she requested it calmly, sipping it slowly before returning the cup to the judge. But there was one thing that seemed to matter more than the sentence itself. She was disappointed by the dress she was given to wear. Not the verdict, not the execution, the dress. And perhaps in that single detail, she revealed more about herself than any confession ever could. When the blade fell in Bremen's Cathedral Square on April 21st, 1831, the city closed a chapter it had spent years refusing to read. Gesche Gottfried, once seen as a pillar of compassion, became a cautionary tale, one that forced an entire community to confront how deeply they had been deceived. Her execution, the last public one in the city's history, marked more than the end of a life. It exposed a collective blind spot, the willingness of a society to confuse sorrow with virtue, to assume that suffering automatically makes someone good. In Gesche's case, that assumption proved fatal for 15 people. For years, she had lived not in the shadows, but in full view, serving, smiling, and soothing, even as she slowly orchestrated the deaths of those who trusted her most. And because she did so while performing the role of the ideal woman, devoted, gentle, nurturing, no one thought to question her. That, perhaps, is the most disturbing element of her story. It wasn't simply the poison or the number of victims that set her apart. It was the fact that her crimes were committed within the very framework that society taught her to embody. She didn't reject her role, she weaponized it. For scholars of criminal psychology, Gesche remains an unsettling study in power dynamics, emotional manipulation, and the darker side of social expectation. Her case challenges our assumptions not just about criminals, but about the very images we associate with goodness. It reminds us that trust, once given freely, can become the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Today, her name rarely appears outside the pages of true crime history, yet her legacy lingers, quietly, uncomfortably, in the background of every story where someone too kind, too composed, and too selfless turns out to be something else entirely. And as we revisit her life through the lens of this true crime documentary, we're left not only with the horror of what she did, but with the question that haunts us long after the facts fade. If someone like Gesche Gottfried could be hiding behind a smile, who else might be?